Chapter 27. Wednesday mid-morning. Doreen laughed at the look on his face. It was one of disgust and yet almost acceptance. "I guess you're getting to know me well, huh?" He sat down on another large rock nearby and studied the water's movement. "The water's definitely rising." She nodded. "It is indeed. But I don't think it's too dangerous yet. But then it's getting harder to reach Steve's house." He looked at her and laughed. "Oh, well, that's a benefit of the water rising. I never considered that you were going up through the creek though. I travel via the creek every time I can. You might want to consider getting yourself a kayak." That stopped her cold. "Seriously?" He shrugged and said, "Why not? You're only a few houses from the lake. For one, I don't know how to kayak. Although I think those boards people stand on look really graceful. I mean, that would be them looking graceful." She shuddered. "You know I'll be the one who's upside down in the water." He chuckled. "But you swim, don't you?" When she didn't answer immediately, he asked again with a narrowed gaze and in a much harder voice. She looked at him and nodded. "I know how, but I haven't had to in a long time." "I can understand that," he said. "But at least you know how to survive if you get into trouble, right?" "Maybe," she said. "I haven't tried in a long time." He nodded. "The lake isn't far. After the high water has dropped again, you could certainly end up with a nice calm pathway to the lake for a swim." "Would the current be a problem?" "Not necessarily if it's slow." "If you say so," she said with a laugh. "I'm never really sure anymore what is hard work and what isn't. I would never have considered I could do as much gardening as I have." "You're learning a lot about yourself. That's a good thing." "Maybe," she said. "Being single is very different than what I thought it would be." "Yes," he said, "that's the point. You keep challenging yourself and doing more and more. I'm not against trying out a kayak. It's been a few years, but it's quite a unique experience." She looked at him in delight. "Is that something we could rent?" "We certainly could, but we could also keep our eyes open for second-hand ones." She looked at the creek, looked at her backyard, and said, "We could just leave from here, couldn't we?" He chuckled. "Of course, that's one of the benefits of living on the river." She smiled. "You know what? I think that might not be a bad idea after all. Now that you'll have all that newfound wealth," he said, "you can consider it." "Ha, if there is any money," she scoffed. "Speaking of which, I plan to go to the other hardware store to get a second quote on the deck material." "Good idea. But first I need to ask you some questions." At that, he pulled a recorder out of his pocket and laid it on the rock. Then he turned it on, lifted an eyebrow, and said, "Now tell me exactly what you know about this case." She groaned. "Isn't that cheating?" He chuckled. "No, it's called using whatever sources I can. And lately you've become a hell of a source." She laughed and said that didn't sound too bad. In fact, it sounded darn good. "Okay, I'll start from the beginning." And so she gave him the rundown of talking to Peter's father, Jeremiah, and then to Peter, and then the research she had done on Manny and Norbert the banker. Then, when she finally worked her way down to her possible theory, she said, "And of course you should know, like you always tell me, those are my theories and not actual facts." He hit the stop button on the recorder and said, "But that's not bad. I don't know if anybody made a connection between Norbert's and Manny's deaths before." "Norbert's death was 5 days later," she said. "Then his wife remarried within 30 days. Mac's eyebrows went up again at that. "That's awfully fast." "Considering it was a hit and run and nobody was ever charged, my mind immediately goes to the wife." He snorted. "That could be you in that position." "I tried to save my marriage," Doreen said. And of course, now I have no idea why I bothered. But in Norbert's case, I think the wife was more than happy for Norbert to disappear. Also, all of Solomon's notes in there talk about the suspected theft from the bank where Norbert worked was an inside job. Or a setup. I looked that up and printed off a copy to go into the file, Max said. It's an interesting read, but no charges were ever filed. Norbert died soon afterward. Which is sad. Maybe, Max said, but you have to think about that now and realize it might have been not so much a hit and run as much as a suicide, Doreen interrupted him. Exactly. But he had Manny in his life too, she said. Remember that. Although he'd just gone missing, so? He gave her a sideways look. I get it, she said. Manny was of that lifestyle, and obviously not somebody you would expect Norbert to want to spend more time with, but they had a relationship, and a long-term one apparently. And you have to consider that anybody with a long-term relationship will have feelings, one way or another. Maybe Norbert was happy to end things, or maybe Manny wanted more. But then we also have to remember that ring, and maybe Norbert gave it to him. What would be the reasoning behind that? Maybe it wasn't an engagement ring as much as a friendship ring or a promise ring, and he was promising to get out of his marriage and to run away with Manny. Doreen studied the rising creek and thought about how she liked that idea. But when she glanced at Mac, he studied her with amusement. She frowned at him. What's so funny? You are, he said. Even after all you've been through, you're still a romantic. She shrugged. I don't know what makes somebody a romantic, but I wouldn't have said I was. Of course not, he said, and that's what makes it all the more endearing. She glared at him, not sure if she'd just been insulted. But from the grin on his face, she thought he was probably having fun at her expense again. The trouble was, she couldn't really get too mad at him, because she teased him all the time too. So we have to find out what the cause of Manny's death was, she said. And seriously, there'll be a lot more people than we expected in this. Meaning? Meaning, she said, I suspect it'll be more than one or two or both involved. Convoluted as usual, he said. Meaning, was there one murderer or two murderers? She raised both hands in frustration. I think the cases are connected. But I don't know if Norbert's wife killed Manny because Manny would run away with Norbert, or if somebody killed both of them. Or there's no connection at all, Max said, reminding her. Just because we like to weave stories between cases doesn't mean the stories are true. Exactly, she said. And I get that, but at the same time, there is a connection. I think it was stronger than we figured. I also emailed you the letter Manny left for Peter. Did you read it? I did. It's also in the file. And I'll talk with Peter now. Max stood. Doreen jumped to her feet. Let me come, she cried out. He looked at her, raised his eyebrows, and said, Why? This will be an official visit. Her mind raced from excuse to excuse, and then she beamed a smile at him. Because he knows me, and he doesn't trust the police. I'm sure you'd get a better reception if I went with you. And he'll be distraught when you give him the news. Mac tapped his toe on the ground for a long moment, then looked down at the animals and said, I suppose you'll want to bring the animals? Absolutely. Peter met them all last Sunday, when I first met with him. They are great icebreakers. Mac rolled his eyes. But we must leave now. I have to be back at the office soon. Take your truck then, she asked, and he nodded. Perfect. I'll be ready in 2 minutes. At that, she ran back into the house, calling the animals to her. Goliath raced past her and up to the kitchen door. Meanwhile, Muggs was at her heels, while Thaddeus made a weird cackling sound on her shoulder. Inside, she grabbed her purse, set the alarm, locked the door again, and then walked with Mac around to his truck in the driveway. The animals got thoroughly excited when they realized they were going for a ride in his truck. She opened the door for Muggs, who jumped up on the floorboard and stayed there quite happily. Goliath, on the other hand, had no intention of staying low, and decided to lie on the headrest but ended up across her shoulder. So Doreen sat down with Muggs at her feet, Thaddeus on her shoulder, and Goliath trying to take over the headrest. It took Goliath a couple minutes until he finally lay down on her lap, contentedly. Thaddeus switched sides to give himself more room. Mac looked at them and sighed heavily. Then he started the engine and drove down the cul-de-sac. "Are you expecting the town to see you as anything other than the odd animal lady?" "Considering Peter called me the bone lady," she said, "I don't think that's fair." He chuckled. "I've heard you referenced as the bone lady many times." "It's better than the other name I hear," she said in a dry tone, "which is the crazy animal lady."